Well, we've got, as you see, a business agenda later on in the evening, but before we get to that, Roy's going to talk to us about Northamptonshire's radical past.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, first of all, who was born and bred in Northamptonshire? Hands up. We actually got some. Well, that's quite incredible. So we've got a couple of radicals. I fortunately or unfortunately was born and bred in Northamptonshire, a place called Thraston, then Valley. And it's interesting when you talk about the industrial history of Northamptonshire. The bulk of the industry was around the embryonic industry in the 19th century was around Northampton. It didn't quite reach Thraston. It reached Ringsted, but it didn't reach Thraston. So when you talk about Northamptonshire's industrial heritage, there isn't all that much before the 19th century, and it didn't reach Thraston. So Northamptonshire is an extremely rural, was an extremely rural county right up until the end of the 19th century. And in fact, some people would say it was the most feudal county in England. Now, you know, we could discuss that. Most historians say that Northamptonshire is the county of squires and spires. That's not altogether true, because a lot of counties have got squires and spires. What we've got in Northamptonshire, we've got a lot of aristocrats, you know, and that's something that is quite interesting when you look at industrial development, because the aristocrats in Northamptonshire didn't put their money around in quite the way they did in coalfield areas, for example. So if you had coal under the ground, you dig a hole and you make loads of money thereafter. In Northamptonshire, there's a lot of iron ore under the ground, but the great landowners didn't dig the holes in the ground and take advantage of that set of circumstances. Anyway, what I'll try to do tonight, I won't take too long, because I know you've got a heavy business agenda, talk on the main themes of development in Northamptonshire, and you can't escape the fact that shoemaking, bootmaking is a very, very important factor. Also, it's important to remember that the agricultural history and other factors come into play when you look at the development in the 19th century. The growth of the cooperative movement, for example, very strong in Northamptonshire, and the role of religion. Now, with regard to religion, most radicalism up until fairly recently was quite often on the back of religion. Northamptonshire has a tradition of non-conformity. You know, that's one of the defining characteristics, I would suggest. But when you start looking at history, books around Northamptonshire, there are quite a lot of theses and dissertations written about the radical past, but there's no cohesive thread, so there's a job for some PhD student in the future to draw all these threads together. The local history societies seem to me to concentrate on what the lords and ladies of years ago used to do. And more recently, they talk about the airfields of Northamptonshire, you know, glorifying or taking special cognizance of the fact that there are lots of aircraft flying around Northamptonshire 70 or 80 years ago. And railways, there's always a lot of nostalgia about railways. So if you look at the stuff that's published on Northamptonshire, you'll see, you know, there's not all that much about the basic industries or the radicalism, little bits of radicalism that were in those industries. I'm giving you a definition of radical. Hopefully it makes some sort of sense. The radical element in Northamptonshire goes way back to medieval times. In fact, there was a radical in Rothwell called Godric of Rothwell, who was one of the last Saxons to be rounded up by William the Conqueror. So, you know, East Anglia was the last place in England where William the Conqueror managed to take control of the country. And Godric of Rothwell was one of Hereward's leading supporters and activists. What happened to him, I don't know. I haven't discovered it. Of course, we talk about the English Civil War and the Battle of Naseby. Now, most of us were told there was an English Civil War, but more contemporary historians talk about the English Revolution. Economic factors led to an embryonic middle class in the form of the gentry making a stand against aristocracy. So the evolution of Northamptonshire coincides with, to a certain extent, with the evolution of England. Some historians, myself included, would now talk about the English Revolution, but it is a contentious issue, whether it's just a civil war or whether it was a change brought about by economic circumstances, you know, the developments of the gentry and the squirearchy, challenging the aristocracy at that time. So you could say that was radical. Northamptonshire was a centre for lace making. I haven't come across any references to militant lace makers, and incidentally, Wellingborough was quite a centre for lace making. And one of the things I discovered was that Wellingborough was also a centre for gaiter making, leather gaiters. It was one of the probably the leading centre for the making of leather gaiters in the 19th century, which is quite interesting because welly boots, rubber boots, hadn't come into existence. The other interesting feature is, of course, that there was a tanning industry, curry tanning industry in Northamptonshire, and there was an enormous demand after or during the Industrial Revolution for things like leather belts. You know, so there were lots of leather was required to relate to economic development in the 19th century, and some of that, obviously, some of the leather was produced in Northamptonshire. And Northamptonshire, for a variety of reasons, lent itself to the tanning of hides and the leather industry, the availability of water, obviously, and oak trees, oak bark tan, and so on and so forth. So there were these factors that came together. Not much recorded about militancy amongst the tanners. I haven't come across any. It's very, very much a small-scale industry, small units around that. Okay, I'm on page 2. There's 371 pages to go. Yeah. When you start looking around for things historical, at County Hall, there is a row of bricks, and on those bricks are the signatures of Quakers who returned during the religious turns and froings a few years ago in the 16th, 17th century. These Quakers left their marks, indelible marks, in the stonework around judges' quarters. The cobblers. Cobblers are mentioned in this book, which everybody should read, The Making of the English Working Class. It's been reprinted many, many times. The cobbler was often the village sage. They were the people who spread news around the communities. And they were quite often very, very militant, quite often very, very radical. And there are quite a few references to the radicalism of the village cobblers. In the late 18th century, cobblers were prosecuted and locked up in Northamptonshire for spreading pamphlets related to Thomas Paine's work. Thomas Paine, the English revolutionary. And, you know, the Northamptonshire cobblers identified, in general, identified with Paine. Canal mania very much influenced what happened in Northampton in the early part of the 19th century. Now, if you look at where shoemaking was located, you find that there were several centres. Obviously, Northampton was one. Another one was Stafford, and another one was Hackney in London. Now, in London, there were London Corresponding Societies, London Trades Clubs, and the shoe workers there were quite militant. So when the canals were built, the London bosses thought, well, we'll nip up the canal because there are shoe workers in Northampton, and we can get away from these militants in London. So the manufacturers came to Northampton, and lo and behold, a lot of the Hackney and London shoemakers followed them. Okay? Now, alongside that, what you have to remember is that there were no factories. There were no shoe factories. At this time, factories were being built in the north and in the Midlands. That didn't happen in the shoe industry, right? What you had warehouses. The people who controlled the warehouses, you could call them manufacturers. The bosses owned the warehouses. They gave out work. So shoemaking was based on what was called outworking. The shoe worker would go to the warehouse, collect materials, go home, make shoes. One family would make approximately 8 pairs of shoes a week. They would take their shoes back to the warehouse, get their money from the bosses. Right? Now in London, they were getting more than they were in Northampton. So there was an interesting fusion of radical activity when this happened around about 1810, 1815, after Napoleonic Wars, around about that time. The Northamptonshire shoemakers were non-conformist radicals, in the sense they were not particularly religious. Right? They were not particularly religious. So they were militant in the sense they were against organised religion. Northamptonshire was a centre of non-conformity, right? So you had these interesting strands coming together in Northampton, and in the period 1815 up to about 1850, there are a whole series of strikes, right? And the unions were developing. They called themselves cordwainers, so you had various cordwainer unions. Fragmented, small units quite often. So you had unions for clickers. They're one of the clicking is one of the exercises that used in a shoe factory, cutting up of the hide. Click, click, click. So the clickers were considered elitist, so they had their own section. So you had small fragmented groups of workers in different unions and different associations. Okay, jumping on a bit, the big issue arose in the 1850s because, as I've said, the industry was not mechanised. It was not mechanised. The first machine was put in a shoe factory in 1854 in Wellingborough, a Howe sewing machine, right? A Howe sewing machine was put in a factory in Wellingborough. And the shoe workers were very upset about this. The manufacturers, the men in the warehouses, said, we are going to mechanise the industry, we're going to import cheap machinery, and we're going to have machines. Now, obviously, the cobblers and the sages in the community knew what had happened in the rest of the country. You had Luddism, you had the Captain Swing riots and so on, opposition to the imposition of machinery and the development of manufacturers. Okay, so the scene was set. The scene was set. There was an almighty strike in 1859, lasted for 6 weeks. The workers were determined not to become, quote marks, mechanised. Right? The unions took the masters on, and they were relatively successful. Now, it was relatively easy to set up a shoemaking factory because you didn't need a great deal of capital to buy a Singer or a Howe sewing machine or a Goodyear welting machine. You didn't need it. you needed a lot of money to start up a railway, or even to dig a coal mine, I suppose, but to set up the shoe factory was relatively simple. So a lot of the artisan shoemakers, in fact, became bosses, right? They became bosses. So the bosses were very, very close to the workers, right? That was a factor, a very important factor when you look at the religious dimension, because nonconformity, Wesleyanism was there, right? Opposition to high church and so on. So it was, the development of radicalism in Northamptonshire was different to the way it developed elsewhere. Leicestershire, just up the road, was an easy touch. An easy touch, it was easy for the manufacturers to build factories and put machines in them, because they had a different cultural inheritance compared to Northampton and Northamptonshire. Okay. Where am I? The Northampton shoe workers did identify with the GNCTU, the Grand National Confederated Trade Union, set up by Robert Owen, and there's still a few documents around that. So there was an awareness that things could be better. Robert Owen, some people call him utopian socialist, founder of cooperation. So that was another important factor. Okay, a series of disputes from 1855 against the introduction of machinery, but gradually in the 1860s, the industry was being, quote marks, mechanised. Now, the shoe worker, independent-minded, nonconformist, had his cultural baggage. The shoe worker liked to go off to the fields occasionally, right? He used to like to go and dig his garden. That didn't fit in with the way factories were organised and how the workers were treated in these factories. So you had these independently minded people aware of what mechanisation had done a little bit further north and so on. So the scene was set for a showdown. Now, during the 1860s, 1870s, gradually the industry, as I say, it was mechanised. Gradually, trade unionism developed. In 1874, the disparate elements in the working class movements, or in the shoemakers' fraternity, came together, and you had the establishment of the National Union of Boot and Shoe Operatives. Now, a defining characteristic of NUSO was that they believed in arbitration. Right? Now, to have a proper system of arbitration, you have to have a proper. Do we need arbitration? You need an organised employer side as well as an organised employee side. Okay, but the manufacturers, they were small manufacturers. They were in business, out of business. Sometimes they were back on the shop floor, as it were, and sometimes they were the bosses. So it was a fascinating scenario. But gradually, factories did get bigger, and gradually the employers became better organised. Now, a whole series of disputes right through from 1860 right through until 1895. But in 1895, the manufacturers won the battle, right? They won the battle. They had prepared the ground, locked the shoe workers out. Shoe workers, the union, thought they had to accept arbitration. The repercussions of arbitration were that shop stewards were not allowed. Now, I can talk from personal experience because as a cultural lag right through to the 1960s, shop stewards were not permitted. Everything had to go to a full-time officer or sit in an office with an employee. That was the way industrial relations was conducted, right? Because that was the agreement stretching right back to 1895. Okay. Having said that, of course, there were pockets of militancy, pockets of radicalism And this lingered on right through to the outbreak of the First World War. One of the interesting features locally, and Richard Jackson says I've got to mention it, was the Rawn's March of 1905. In the aftermath of the Boer War, there was suddenly a decrease in the amount of boots required, and so the Rawn's bootmakers found themselves out of work. So, or didn't have much work. So they organised themselves, and 100 of the fittest bootmakers of Rawn's marched to London. Right? The Rawn's marched to London 1905, all the way to Trafalgar Square, where they attracted thousands of people. Keir Hardie spoke on their behalf. They went to Parliament and protested about wages and conditions in the industry, and they were thrown out of Parliament. Now, when I was young, I lived next door to a Rawn's marcher, Benny Mantle. Right? His uncle was the first secretary of the Rushden branch of the National Union of Boot and Shoe Operatives. At 34 Halford Street, Thrapston, lived a chap called Bill Sykes. Bill Sykes was one of the Rawn's marchers. His son became a Corby councillor. His name was Tom Sykes, and he was kicked out of the Labour Party. I don't quite remember the reasons why when I was very young, but you know, there's this cultural lag. So you know, history is near to us in that respect. Okay, I'm jumping on ahead because I realise there's several things that I haven't touched on. But the battle against arbitration, to a certain extent, between the socialists and the liberals. Northampton was one of the strongest liberal seats in the country. One of the liberal MPs was Manfield, the shoe man, voted in by those shoe workers that have the vote with an overwhelming majority. And of course, the shoe workers elected Charles Brandlaw, who was the first atheist MP. Right. Okay, so I'll leave that there. Move on to other aspects. Yeah. What have we got here? Yeah, the cooperative movement in Northamptonshire. Strong, right? Strong. In Rawn's, there was a shoemaker called William Nichols. Right? He managed to buy up some of the smaller shoe factories and became the dominant employer in Rawn's. Now, the Rawn's workers decided that they would set up their own cooperative, workers' cooperative, the St Crispin Shoe Cooperative. St Crispin, the patron saint of shoe workers. Okay, so St Crispin was a cooperative. There was a cooperative set up in Ringsted. Now, Ringsted is an interesting place because there was a large family of Roberts there. And if you look at the records, you'll find that some of the Roberts were blacklegs when there were strikes and so on. And one of them was the grandfather of a young woman who moved in Grantham, the Roberts of Rawn. On the other hand, there was a radical branch of the Roberts as well. So all the Roberts weren't right wing. Okay.
They weren't all snobby Roberts.
Snobby Roberts. Yeah, that's what they used to call it. Yeah, snobby Roberts. Yeah. Wellingborough co-op's quite big. They even had cooperative fish and chip shops in Wellingborough. Remember, fish and chips came about, in the middle of the 19th century. Wellingborough co-op just thought, this is a good one. So Wellingborough co-op set up fish and chips. Lots of cooperative developments. There were farms. Desborough Co-op had a big farm. Rawn's Co-op had farms. Desborough Co-op even had quarries. Some iron ore was actually taken out of cooperative quarries, is that the right term, in Desborough. There were shoe factories, obviously, Avalon at Rothwell. I think Richard worked in one in Rusden. Yeah, Desborough. The world's biggest corset factory was Desborough. Desborough Corsetry, CWS factory, Federation Avenue, Desborough. All those whale bones that they used to put in corsets in Desborough, right? Lots of houses were built by cooperatives. Kettering Neal Avenue, Kingston Avenue, that area, mainly built by cooperative labour. The co-op even had railway sidings. Where the co-op was built a few years ago was the old cooperative railway siding. Now that is owned by Asda. Yeah. What else? Yeah, so that very quickly is the shoe bit and the co-op bit, agricultural bit. Yeah, you know more about diggers than I do when we're talking about that. There was a branch of the Agricultural Workers Union in Northamptonshire, and at times they did take action. Joseph Arch lived just across, came from just over the border in Warwickshire. It wasn't a strong area for the agricultural workers. They were mainly Warwickshire and then they were stronger in East Anglia, but they were around. Now, one of the interesting things about industrial strife in Northamptonshire is that in 1913, on Lord Lilford's estate near Thrapston, there was a lockout and there was a dispute, and on and on and on. Now, again, being not in the first flush of youth, I remember one of the men who were in that strike, a man called Philip Gray. Now, Philip Gray lived in Titchmont. Which is just near to Milford, he was one of those kicked off the Lord's estate. Remember tied cottages, people living on the side of the road, you know, quite ghastly. Philip Gray went to the Great War. When he came back, he couldn't get a job, so he started a coal bit, a wheelbarrow. He was selling coal around Thrapston area. And then in the 40s, he was elected as a county councillor, a Labour county councillor for Thrapston. You know, it was fascinating. But they knew Philip because he had a green lorry delivering coal around Thrapston, so he knew people, but that's where he came from. And yeah, somebody I remember, the same as I remember Bill Sykes and Benny Mantle. So, you know, we're not all that far away from all these things as they develop, as they happen. Right, the other major factor that I've touched on is religion, non-conformity. Northamptonshire was non-conformist or nothingtarian. They were nothing. William Booth of Salvation Army fame came to Northampton in the 1880s to convert the heathen, the shoemakers, through Rocknegs, and he had to get back on the train and go back to London. Right? Remember, Bradlaugh was around at that time as well. So they were nothingtarian, but a lot of the trade union people at that time were primitive Methodists. Now, I remember, Paul, not so long ago, we went to Yorkshire. We were in this old barn. Remember me pointing it out. I saw this sign, Primitive Methodist Chapel. Primitive Methodists, a fascinating group of people, set up around about 1808, and they were reabsorbed into Wesleyanism, Methodism when there was a reform in 1932. Why is primitive Methodism important? Because many of the early trade union leaders, many of the early radicals were primitive Methodists. Almost all of them. Joseph Arch, good example, many others. They were egalitarian. they were the first religious sect, if you want to call them a sect, in England that had women preachers. You didn't need any qualification.
Sorry.
You didn't need any qualification to be a preacher.
Can I just interrupt there? In the 1640s, what about Mary Carey? Never heard of Mary Carey?
Yes.
Famous woman preacher?
Yes.
It was
But she wasn't accepted
tradition
as such.
Baptists and Congregationalists have women preachers.
Yeah, but they weren't accepted by
They were accepted by the Baptist and Congregational people. The Quakers, unfortunately, did a deal with the government on the Restoration, so they watered it down. Northamptonshire has always been a Baptist and Congregational county, not Methodist.
Yeah, but
In the rural areas, maybe. In the town areas, there's a big tradition, Congregationalism and Baptists.
I know there were lots of informal women preachers, but the primitive Methodists actually encouraged, as I understand, encouraged women. And the layout of the chapels, they were quite often old barns, or not such old barns, somebody's house, where they had their services, and anybody could be a preacher, and the preachers were only paid the same rate as a labourer, right? And that's where a lot of early trade union leaders learned their skills. I do take your point, there are many examples right back in the history where women became preachers against the hierarchy of the organisation, but the nonconformists, the primitive Methodists, actually encouraged it. I think that's one of the subtle differences there. Okay, now there are still buildings where primitive Methodists used to meet in Northamptonshire. It was said that they were a break away from Wesleyanism. It was said that Wesleyanism was for the working class, whereas primitive Methodists were of the working class. Wesleyanism was taken over to a certain extent by the middle class, right? Especially it was noticeable in Northampton. So the middle class manufacturers were frowned upon by the Anglican High Church, so they went to the Wesleyan alternative. Okay, where were these chapels, or these places? There's one in Brigstock, but incidentally, Brigstock had a factory from 1805, which is interesting. Deanshanger, Great Doddington, Bath Road, Kettering, King Sutton, Milton, Malsall, Northampton, Park Avenue, Northampton, there's Northampton Primitive Chapel, I couldn't find out where that was. Rusden, Fitzwilliam Street, from 1881 to 1930 when it was closed down. Rush Tom, near Geddington, they had a primitive Methodist chapel. It's now the village hall. So they were quite strong. In Raunds, they were in Marshall Road, which is now a Catholic church. So they were an important element. Okay. The political dimension, just to finish off because I'm aware of the time, the political dimension was a Cromwellian stronghold. It was also a Chartist stronghold. I came across this book. This was written by a Chartist in the 19th century. And I'm quoting from the book now. This was in 1841. At Northampton, the Chartists assembled in the Market Square, which is one of the prettiest in England, to testify their devotion to democracy. John Robbins, a warm-hearted son of toil, was the chairman, who in his opening speech alluded to the swearing in of specials, calling out of pensioners and other silly proceedings of the authorities. Mr. Leatherland of Kettering, author of Base Oppressors Leave Your Slumbers, each, along with other comrades, addressed the audience. Now, an aside, when I had the honour of being a Kettering Borough Council, they built a new road, and the council officer said, "What are we going to call it?" So I said, "Well, it's Kettering was associated with leather. Let's call it Leatherland. And the Conservatives said, that's a good idea. They didn't realise that I was having it named after a leading Kettering Chartist. Okay. So Northamptonshire was quite an important place for Chartism. And in fact, as you probably know, Chartists did run against the established parties. One or two of them actually got into farming. Okay. Yeah, missionaries in Northampton reported that their exercises were quite successful. Okay, so the political dimension, Chartism evolved. You had the Social Democratic Federation later on, and they contested seats for school boards, other public bodies in Northampton. In Northampton, one of the leaders was Gribble, who was the leader of the Raunds marches in 1905. You had in Kettering 2 socialist independent Labour Party members elected to Kettering Council in 1894. Right? So there is this continuum, if you like, and Wellingborough elected a Labour MP Walter Smith in 1919, and Kettering had the first Co-op Party MP, Alf Waterton, at that same election. Up until that time, the shoe workers had supported the Liberals. It evolved into Labism. 2 seats were allocated to places like Northampton, and they said one for the middle class and one for the workers. Okay, so you had 2 MPs, Manfield. Pardon me. Okay, I think I'll leave it there because I'm aware of this 10 to 9. So I think you
Thank you.
said something very discussed.
Yeah. Yeah, have we got any questions or Roy or points that people want to make?
One point that I didn't mention was in Corby, around about 1910, workers there in the iron making blast furnace tried to form a trade union. They were locked out by the employers, and the state used the police force against them, and there was some atrocities there at that particular time.
What date was that? When
I
was it?
think it was 1910, around about that time.
Yeah, I deliberately didn't talk about Corby and the development of the steel industry.
Well, there's some riots, and I seem to remember hearing about riots in the Market Square in Northampton at some. Is that post First World War? I can't remember.
There's quite a lot of direct activities, for want of a better term, in Northampton, yeah. And in Kettering. I mean, yeah, but a man called Inskip, I think of the second General Secretary of NUBSO, would speak, and you get literally thousands of people turning out. The old Liberal Club in Kettering is now, I think, Trustee Savings Bank. The whole of Kettering seized up because they were all outside the Liberal Club, and there were many such events in Northampton and Wellingborough. And often they did have riots. I mean, there was Charles East factory in Kettering was built in the 1870s, I think it was. And the workers were corralled. They used to lock the workers in, literally. And the workers, on one occasion, were throwing machines out of the windows. And the military were on alert for riots in Kettering. So, yeah, I mean, it was pretty grim. You see, that the shoe workers were accustomed to, when trade was slack, to go up to the fields and work in the fields or do whatever they did in the fields. But then they were corralled, they were literally locked up in these factories as the manufacturers got their hand. So yeah, there are lots of instances throughout the county of riots.
Wasn't most places have their own brickworks, haven't they?
Sorry?
Most places.
Yeah. I haven't mentioned anything about brickworks,
It's great following the movements and the resistance and these great symbolism and the great sort of organisations of resistance and sort of collective activity. What were the notable achievements, would you say? There was a half a dozen notable achievements that this myriad of different movements created. Were there any ones you'd highlight?
Well, there were strikes in the back in the 1970s, there were strikes in 1870s and 1880s that were won by the shoemaker.
What, a rise in wages?
Well, the usual things that trade unionists strive for. I mean, you were talking about, I can't remember, 52-hour weeks, so I got it down to 50 hours. And I mean, the shoemaker in the 1870s would be on about, it varied, but let's say something a little bit more than £1, whereas an agricultural labourer would be below £1. It fluctuated according to the state of the economy. And of course, if you're a shrewd trade union leader, you'll encourage your workers to do the business or do the striking at advantageous times. And they tried that in 1895, but it backfired because by then manufacturers had got organised. But yeah, there were a lot of successes, and in fact the numbers of joining unions began to shoot up.
Thanks, Roy. The talk was really good, enjoyed it. A couple of names that cropped up with me, particularly around the agricultural workers that you mentioned. I was active in the TNG, and at that time the agricultural workers amalgamated with the Transport and General Workers Union about, I think it was about 1989 or 90, and I used to be in touch with a guy called Ernie Hackney from Woodford, yeah. And at that time, trade unions could not nominate people onto state bodies. He was actually on, I think it was Anglian Water Authority then, and we could put people in the post as, I don't know whether they were trustees or whatever. But that because the whole thing, the linkage between agriculture and then into the industrialisation is, and also when I did work for Anglian Water for many years, and I've done a lot of travelling around, particularly East Northampton, going into the county of Bedford, and I noticed a lot of the chapels in the villages were all Wesleyan chapels, but it kind of nearly stopped. Probably Wellingborough, maybe you said there's a couple in Kettering, but North Northamptonshire, I don't think it was as prolific as it was in the Bedford Northamptonshire border. And just out of interest, there were still remnants of that sort of non-conformism. I worked with a guy in Anglian Water, and he was a member of a thing called the Plymouth Brethren sect. I think they had a little meeting room in, I think it was Ringstead or Roans or somewhere like that. But the interesting thing about the shoe workers as well was the arbitration. Now, if any trade union that agrees with arbitration, it's basically a no strike deal arbitration. So I was interested to know if there was arbitration, how they could have taken industrial action. In fact, some of the steel unions, the production steel unions in Corby, if you read Dougie Reed's book, it talks about this act, what was it, steel. They had arbitration up until the 70s, 80s, yeah. So I mean, it's a no strike deal arbitration, because you're relying on the decision of the arbitrators, and that's final. In fact, some employers still try to push it in today when you're trying to sign a recognition agreement. I had it recently with XPO in the Swan Valley. We were doing an agreement, and they tried to put arbitration. This is absolutely no chance. I mean, against our union's policy anyway, but it wasn't happening. But there is, and also we had a celebration a couple of years ago, and there was canal workers at Braunston. They went on strike in 1923 in our new Unite office in Northampton. I've got a cracking photograph on the wall now. It's the size of the wall, but we've moved office Unite in Northampton, and we've got it on the wall now. And we had a celebration a few years ago with, I don't know if anyone knows Peter Frost. He writes in the Morning Star. He lives in Braunston, and he got in touch with us because it's one of our legacy unions, TG, and I think that Prunella Scales and Man West were out there. They came and supported it as well. So there is, but what's always interested me about Northamptonshire.
I mean, there's so much, you can only, I deliberately didn't touch on it, but the canal building, I mean, the workers involved there, navvies, a lot of Irish navvies, I mean, there were over 3,000 navvies, most of them Irish, built the Kettering Manton railway line in the 1870s, 1880s.
Yeah.
You know, they weren't militant. Well, I mean,
No, I'm talking about canal workers, Roy, rather than canal diggers. The people actually worked the canal boats, the barges. Right. That was a strike. And because TG was only formed in 22, so this strike was like 23, 24, so it was that fledgling union going on. Anyway, it went on for quite a while. It's all this hidden history that's in Northamptonshire, about people, working class people, not celebrating their history. And I don't say it out of any pride or anything, but if some of the things that happened in Northamptonshire happened in Ireland, there'd be about 10 songs written about them. And what the final, what I was leading up to was it, how come all this radicalisation never translated into politics? And I think when you look at that NUBSO arbitration thing, that stopped a rise. So what you've identified, even in your time as issue worker early on, is the growth of a shop stewards movement and a rank and file organisation. Arbitration and no shop steward prevents that. And most radicalisation comes from the bottom. It doesn't come from trade union officers or general secretaries. It comes from the bottom. And if you had arbitration, then you don't have the growth of a shop stewards movement.
Yeah, it's interesting what you're saying there, sure, I think, because the question is, one of the major questions, as you imply, is why hasn't Northamptonshire sustained any radicalism? What undercuts radicalism? And that's interesting what you were saying about the trade union movement. And I think also what's Roy was talking about, the industry being a small scale, is also suggests that some larger scale industrialisation, like the Corby steelworks, obviously is a basis for greater organisation, greater trade union organisation, greater labour movement organisation, whereas smaller shoemaking in comparison with, for example, Leicestershire, is very susceptible to sweetheart deals between workers and bosses, isn't it? I mean, I think there are other perhaps other interesting elements like land ownership in Northamptonshire. I strongly suspect that hasn't changed much in hundreds of years. The same families own the land, and they have a political power as a result of that. That transfers into running a county council, for example.
Yeah, fascinating.
And then I think the other thing I've just sort of reminded of in the Wellingborough sort of context is the different populations of Wellingborough, perhaps partly associated with work in the railways through the end of through the 20th century particularly. But I think it's hard to understand how many Tory MPs we've got without thinking, where has radicalism gone? Where's the Labour movement gone to in the last tens of years? And how does it compare with other places that have got much more active labour movements, active labour politics, active trade movements.
Yeah. What Sean was saying earlier about arbitration and the steel works in Corby, and that having an effect on shop stewards and whatever. There were shop stewards, they weren't actually called shop stewards, they were called workers' representatives, they were called branch secretaries, they were called chairmen, they were called whatever. But there was wildcat strikes as well, which moved things forward, despite the arbitration at national level.
Yeah, I mean, you didn't have a shop steward movement in the boot and shoe industry. You know, when I was in the factory, there was nobody to go to if you had a problem. It was no shop steward movement. And the thing is, or was, that they had full-time officers elected from the shop floor with no negotiating background, you know, up against the employers who were drilled in what they were doing. So yeah, it was a sad feature, you know, it was a sad feature.
Roy, in Leicester, the boot and shoe union had a breakaway during the early part of the 20th century, a women's trade union. Is there any evidence that there were members of that women's boot and shoe union in Northamptonshire, and what was the effect of that on the main union, and also attitudes to women and issues around equality for women in the boot and shoe industry?
Well, if you look at the records, you know, it's very, talking about the 19th century, it's a very sexist union. You know, at one stage, some branches were advocating immigration to New Zealand for women who worked in the closing room. There were divisions of labour. The women sat down at sewing machines, and without going into detail, they were called closers. And the men used to say, you know, we should offer these young women the opportunity to emigrate, or subsidise emigration. And that was a common feature of the agricultural workers' union as well. I mean, quite a few agricultural workers did emigrate. Coming back to Leicester, yeah, Leicester was considered an easy touch by the employer. So when they had a rough time in Northampton, they went further up the road. And the Leicester women, as you pointed out, under people like Alice Hawkins, I think she was the first female secretary of the shoe workers. She worked at the Leicester Cooperative factory, and she was succeeded by somebody called Mary Bell, who married, so they set up their Leicester Women's Branch, right? And Bell, Miss Bell, I can't remember her first name, married Richards, who was a male TU, trade union organiser in Leicester. But yeah, there was a significant number, and I think it was around, it wasn't until well into the 20th century that they had a female officer. Yeah, before the, I can't remember the exact dates, I can't remember. Alice Hawkins was a suffragette, around about the suffragette period, working class suffragette, and they were a bit different than middle class suffragettes, and it was reflected in their trade union activities. But yeah, women were a significant proportion of membership. Yeah.
And also the shoes were conventional men's shoes largely in Northamptonshire,
right,
which contrasts sharply with Leicestershire, which advanced with advanced industrial factory methods, diversified into all sorts of children's, women's shoes, fashion shoes, right, etc. And Northampton tended, I think, to suffer, sorry John, but they tended to suffer from getting stuck technically in very traditional forms of manufacture for men.
Correct, yeah. mechanisation enabled Leicester employers to develop stitched soles rather than welted footwear and so on. So, yeah, and a lot of women's shoes. The Northampton manufacturers never produced many women's shoes.
It's going to answer Tony's question about the sort of radicalism. So when I first came down here, we still had new flat about, National Youth Footwear, leather and allied trades, and basically despised in the pubs by the actual people who worked in the shoe industry, because they was very much seen as a boss's union, and there was a short step between being the union rep and being the supervisor and joining the management board. And I always used to be puzzled when people used to go, I'd say people, oh, you know, like the union say, and they go, oh, you're in it. Because back in those days, of course, people collected the subs by hand, and the new flat people kept a good deal of that subs for themselves, like it was a Avon Love Soda. So there was an there was a view that the union was actually the boss's union, and basically was in it because you got to keep the subs.
That was sort of my experience when I worked in Wiltshire. I remember trying to raise issues like health and safety with the new flats officer. The first thing he did, without complaints about blue asbestos hanging out the lagging and the lifts, was to tell the boss, you know, that I was complaining about it, and I was doing it up and I was disciplined. That came straight from me reporting to the new flats official. On the case of him going to health and safety executive in 1976, he was baking hot. I was working there, heating machine. He went straight to the bosses and said, there's this troublemaker down there, raising very hell about blue asbestos. So people go around working around and coughing up stuff, you know. My reading of the non-radical influence of it is, I think, that such was just the strength of imports which undercut the industry completely, and it sort of wiped out. It kind of created sort of a collusion between workers and bosses. The common enemy were imports, which they couldn't compete against. Am I right there? Do you think, well, if that was a sort of collective reason why, you know, had a more pronounced and continuous influence? I think.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether it's a collusion. It's been on 1895. Everything goes to arbitration. Yeah, I mean, if there was a problem, I was in the boot factory for years, as you know. If there was a problem, you'd go and complain, and the union officer would go in to see the boss without you, and you wouldn't know what went on or what the outcome was quite often. Yeah.
But it wasn't important. It was imports which wiped out the industry. Could not
imports.
Sorry. The vast number of imports.
Oh yeah, sorry, I misunderstood you. Yeah, yeah.
Right. Okay. Cheap shoes coming in which we couldn't compete against. That's what wiped out the industry, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean the industry is more or less finished.
True.
Good quality footwear is still being produced, and in fact, if you look at Cheney's and Desborough, the six have got order books absolutely full. They can't get any labour.
Right.
They're paying people over the odds, or what they consider to be over the odds, sometimes 6 days a week, and they've got an enormous backlog because they're making traditional British footwear with German leather.
Roy, kind of summarising things, in terms of the radical history of Northamptonshire, would it be true to say that there isn't really one? That part of the problem for Northamptonshire is that there's a very weak tradition of radicalism. There's pockets of it. There's pockets of Chartism, there's pockets of resistance, trade unions, agricultural workers.
There's the peace movement as well, which has been sort of missed out of the equation a bit, which fed in from, Ron was talking about Quakers. I mean, Quakerism and other religions like the Christadelphians during the First World War were conscientious objectors, and that also fed into the development of the Independent Labour Party.
I mean, but in reality, there was a very weak radical tradition, or was there?
Yeah,
or was there actually a depth to radicalism?
Yeah.
But I get the feeling that there wasn't.
you start looking at definitions. I mean, the cultural inheritance, if you like, is different in bit different in Northamptonshire than what it is in South Yorkshire or
Corby even.
Absolutely, yeah.
But the radicalism in Corby is relatively recent in historical terms, isn't it? It was around the arrival of essentially Scottish immigration.
And I think
Well,
that's...
look, yeah, but the thing is, we never really had an industrial revolution in England, in Northamptonshire.
Yeah.
When people were still digging up potatoes in Northamptonshire while they're making ships in Sunderland or whatever, there was no heavy industry. Classical analysis is that when you get all these workers together, hundreds of workers, you begin to get a trade union consciousness and then a class consciousness. Well, the shoe factory only had a few people, relatively few workers, and they were very close to the employers because the employers were not parachuted in by some big company. They were one step removed from the people they were bossing, if you like. So there is that cultural inheritance, and of course that takes time to work through the system. And you still see the ripples in Corby. Still, in Northamptonshire, you still see the ripples of, if not feudalism, agricultural workers' attitudes. So there are these little differences, but if radicalism is related to heavy industry, then that's the reason why you don't get a great radical inheritance in Northamptonshire.
But it was at one point, and I think Northants was next only to the Rhondda Valley. Rushden was Britain's most intensively one industry town.
It was the most,
next only to the Rhondda
Rushden
Valley.
was the most intensive one industry town in England.
Right, it was pretty incredible.
It developed from about 1870 to 1900, from nothing. Everybody was in the shoe industry. The difference between that and the Rhondda Valley was that the women were in the factories as well, whereas when you're comparing it to the Rhondda, the women didn't at that time go down coal mines. In fact, in Rushden, they imported labour from all over the place. They used to run buses from Corby to Rushden, for example. Different to Rhondda. And if you start looking at that sort of cultural inheritance, you look at the Leicestershire coal mines, Coalville, they didn't have the same community ethos that they had in the Rhondda, which was reflected in the 1984 strike. So different places evolved different cultural characteristics, and Northamptonshire still has, understandably, a ripple from the agricultural stage, if you like. We didn't have Captain Swingboats in Northamptonshire. No Luddism.
Yeah, I think things happen for a reason. One area happens to be more radical than the other. I mean, there's obviously a reason for it, and it's just a pet theory of mine. There was no land agitation in England really to certain parts, and because land was the issue. I mean, I think that psyche of working with pre-industrial revolution, working for, say, an estate, say the Buccleuch estate or the Dean estate, and you were tied to a cottage, there was always that reluctance that, if you did organise, like what happened to the Tolpuddle Martyrs, for example, there was all that, or even, but not as bad as transportation, you were kicked out of your house and on the road, whereas because there was that reluctance then in the agricultural area to do that, I think when the Industrial Revolution came along and hit Northamptonshire, I don't know, it's just a theory of mine, that psyche went with the people when it went in, and it's passed generationally, when people went into the boot and shoe industry, because, I mean, there was some big factories. My brother and sister and brother-in-law worked in Timpson's in Bath Road and Kettering. I mean, that employed a few thousand people.
Few hundred.
Sorry?
Few hundred.
Sorry?
Hundreds.
Yeah. What, in Bathrow?
Not thousands, hundreds.
Do you not think there's, oh, I'm talking about 1,000 dollars. Anyway, but the other thing is as well, and I don't think any, I mean, I'm not parochial about things, but there was a different mindset in Corby, and I would suggest that is because that came from Scottish and Irish people coming into there, and they're no different from any of them from Essex and Northamptonshire, but those people brought with them in their psyche a national struggle. Well, it was never a national struggle in this country.
But would you say, Sean, that if you came from Ireland, Southern Ireland, no heavy industry there,
Yeah,
but there was still a spark of militancy.
yeah, that's right. If you look at the Builders' Union in the big strikes in the say 60s, 50s and 60s from the London, from the Festival of Britain to Shell, to real barbecuing jobs, big industrial disputes in London in the 50s, 60s and 70s, they were all, the construction union unfortunately is not that anymore, but most of the shop stewards and most of the leading officers in the London area in UCAT, the Builders Union, they were all Irish or either members of the Communist Party. And that was a radical union at that time. So, I mean, you're right, they came from a rural area, but what I'm suggesting, because they were involved in a national struggle, or their people were, that brought that with them, that, they didn't need that from the
And there were other unifying factors apart from the industrial.
Sorry?
You're saying there are other unifying factors rather than the industrial.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, well, I think we've got to draw it to a close there. Thank you very much, Joy. It's really interesting. We'll just have a quick 5-minute break and then we'll get through the rest of the agenda.